Hi, Tony from All the Remote Things here again. I've got a fantastic guest this week. But before we get to that, don't forget, if you want to stay connected, learn more about our community, don't forget to join our Discord community. You just go to remoteaf.co, click on the community button and join us. There's a lot of like-minded individuals talking about how we work in remote, talking about agility. We'd love to have you. Whilst you're at it, if you're there, don't forget, have a look at our latest blog on trust. It'd be fantastic for you to have a read of that. Without further ado, my fantastic guest today is the wonderful Jim Highsmith. I'm so happy to have you on today, Jim. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here. I've spent a lot of time down in Australia and had some great times there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Jim, can you just do for those who may not know who you are? I'll just preface it with Jim is obviously one of the signatories of the original Agile Manifesto, but love to hear your bio, just a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's quite a checkered history. I got out of electrical engineering school in 1966. Just to give you an idea of the differences between today and then, when I was in engineering school, we designed circuits using transistors about the big as my end of my finger. Today, there's 5 billion transistors on a chip. And that's the kind of advance in technology that we've seen over the last 60 years. And so when I got out of engineering school, my first project was on the Apollo project. And I had a very small piece of it and really enjoyed it. As I tell people, my first project was a success.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Anyway, so I went on after engineering and got a degree in management and have been in the software industry ever since, doing a variety of things, working for a variety of companies, doing some major pivot points in my career, which I can talk about some. And I've been lucky to have been in kind of the forefront of two different movements, the structured era in the 1980s, and of course the agile movement since about 2000, although part of what I talk about in the book are the roots of agile. There were really a lot of roots that got set in the 1990s that enabled the agile movement to take off in the 2000s. And in addition to that, I have a family, 2 kids, 2 grandkids, a wife, and I live just outside of Denver, Colorado, near Boulder. So that ought to get us started.
Yeah, that does get us started nicely. And I guess that one of the overarching reasons, although as I said to you before when we were chatting off air, is I'm surprised I haven't had you on here because we've got a lot of mutual friends. But the overarching reason for getting you on here is obviously you've written a new book now. I've read the other books that you've written and they're fantastic. But I was really interested in this, and it's called The Wild West to Agile. Before we get into the contents of the book, I guess, why now? Why this book? What was the driver to get this book written and bring it out? Because it really is a different style and a different book to the ones that you've written before.
Yes, it is. And it got started in, just one of those kind of serendipitous ways. But I retired from ThoughtWorks about 2 years ago, and COVID hit. Everybody was kind of closeted. And I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And so, we all reach these points in our lives from time to time. And something kind of clicked in the back of my head about writing a memoir for my grandkids. And so I got really interested in that. And as you can see from the mountain behind me, I've really been an outdoors person, an adventurer for quite a while. And so I wrote a first section on my adventures, and then I got into my career, and I thought, how am I going to interest 2 teenagers in my career? And so the more I got to thinking about it and not doing it in a resume style, because that just would be boring as hell.
Yeah.
So I decided to break my career up into eras and then write about each of those eras. And so as I was doing that, I had a couple of thoughts about, well, maybe people besides my family would be interested in this. And so I queried a couple of friends and they said, oh, they thought it was a pretty good idea. And I ran it by my publisher, and they said, we think it's a pretty good idea. So I launched into actually the writing. And what came out of that was I got to review and do some retrospectives on some things in my life that I really hadn't thought about in depth, and kind of put them together. I talked to people that I hadn't talked to in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, which was really great, reconnecting with some of these people that I had, not talked to in a long time. And so it came out as sort of a memoir-ish history of software development based on my experiences. And that was great fun writing. And it ended up being both for my grandkids and for a wider audience.
It really struck a note with me that for your children thing and how you influence some teenagers, because I have teenage children myself. And I think for about the last 10 years, they've been saying to me, what do you actually really do? And when you try to explain it to them, they sort of for about 2 seconds and then the eyes glaze over and it's it. So
Right.
I really love the way that you did that. And let's just talk a little bit about the construct of the book, because I thought that was really unique as well. You talk about it in terms of braids or threads. Talk to me a little bit about where that came from and how you thought about doing that.
Well, this was a difficult book to write. It was a great undertaking, and I really enjoyed it. But the organization was really difficult, because I wanted to talk about software development and the history of software development. I wanted to talk about my experiences. I wanted to talk about some of the pioneers, both in the previous eras and in the agile era, and give them some credit for being pioneers. And then I wanted to look at the technology advances and the management changes over time and roll all that together. And so I had it one way, and then I worked on it some more. And I happened to be talking to my goddaughter, Amy, and she is an author. She's written several books. She teaches writing at a university, and she's an environmental writer. And so we got to talking one day, and I was telling her about some of my issues, and she said, there is such a thing as braided narratives. And she talked to me a little bit about that, and I said, this is the organizing principle that I need. One of the things that I have tried to do with all of my books is I've tried to make them enjoyable to read as well as informative. And I have tried to put various and sundry different things into the book. My first book, I used a lot of mountain climbing analogies. In my next book, I used a lot of interviews with some of the key agile signatories to the manifesto. The next book in the project management, I used an interview style. So I've been trying to put different kinds of things into the writing of the book. I've taken several writing workshops and read a lot about writing. So that was one of the things that sort of drove me to this braided narrative kind of thing. And the other writing idea that I've always used is this idea of creative nonfiction. So nonfiction doesn't have to be dull and boring. It can be creative, and you can use some of the same kinds of storytelling examples in a creative nonfiction as you can in nonfiction, as you can in fiction. So that's been a part of my writing since I started, was trying to put different things in it.
I would say, having read the book, I literally consumed it quite quickly, and it's because it's really storytelling, and the way you've intertwined the narratives are really great. One of the things I really like about the book is, I've been doing the agile thing for quite some time, nowhere near as obviously as long as yourself, but one of the things, and I've had the opportunity to work with Alistair Coburn quite a bit and picked his brains on how the agile thing sort of came about and the stories in the background, right? Because you always want to know those. But the interesting thing, Jim, is I see so many things out on websites and so many people writing things about it that are just wrong from what I knew. And this is the first time I've actually seen in a book the narrative of where it sort of came from, even just you starting your experience in structured and back in the day when, Fortran and all those sorts of things, but then flowing through to how agile actually came about. And I thought that was a fantastic. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I think that's a great narrative that you ran through. Was that really intentional?
Yeah, it was very intentional. And to just tell you a funny story about Alistair and memory, there was a pre-meeting to the Agile Manifesto meeting that Kent Beck called in Oregon. And I could have sworn that Alistair was at that meeting. In fact, I wrote it into the book that he was in that meeting. And I was talking to him one day and he said, no, I wasn't in that meeting. So, memory sort of plays tricks on you. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to give people some background and have them realize that Agile didn't spring from nothing in 2001. There were a lot of things that went before and a lot of changes in the software development that went on, but there were also a lot of changes in the industry that went on during that period of time that drove the need for Agile. So there was the need for Agile, and Agile came about as a result of some of that. For example, people don't realize, I don't think, how big a transition change it was, a pivot it was in the mid-90s when the internet came out. In terms of, before that, all systems were for internal users in corporations and organizations. And then all of a sudden, your systems have to appeal to the end customer. And that was a huge transition for thinking about how to design systems for internal customers and design systems for external customers. And so that's one of the things that drove Agile, was that need to experiment because you didn't know what the requirements were. When you're building an internal system, you can go talk to people and say, what do you do? And you can duplicate that with software. When you are going out to customers, you don't always have that benefit of understanding exactly what they want. So it was much more of an experiential, experimental kind of software development. So that was one of the things that drove us to more agile approaches.
I think one of the things I picked up, and I've heard you say it before, but you said that Agile was suited at the time to the complexity of the stacks that you started to deal with. But my question to you with that is, because I can understand that, but that means to me that Agile is even more suited to the complexity that we deal with today more than ever. What's your thoughts on that with the changes and the growth and the speed of change that we're seeing?
I think it continues to be a critical piece of our arsenal. And in the book, I talk about methods, methodology, and mindset.
Yeah.
And Agile is an umbrella for many different methodology: Scrum, LESS, XP, Crystal, Heart of Agile. And so the manifesto is sort of an umbrella for that. Agile, sort of an umbrella for that. And each one of those things may evolve a little bit differently, but I think the critical piece of this is, I don't think the rate of change is going to decelerate.
Yeah.
And so the only viable strategy that you have is to be more agile. So agility is the goal. And whether you get that through Scrum or something else, XP, as long as you're focused on agility and building leadership that is agile leadership, which we could talk about too, that's the real issue. And one of the things that I've been doing is I've been trying to think quite a bit about Agile and the Agile Manifesto, and does it need to change, and some of the problems with it. And I am convinced that Agile is an appropriate goal, and that we're going through a transformation process, just like we try to transform organizations into more digital organizations and more agile development practices. Maybe it's time for Agile itself to go through a transformation. But in a transformation, one of the things you do is you keep what is still good and valid, and then you change some other things. And so what I'd like to do is to have people talk about, what is it about Agile? Why is it so important? Why was it so successful? And once we understand why it was so successful, we can keep those parts and then change or extend the other parts. And I think this is something that I've been talking to people about as to how to get that sort of rolling and get people interested. Because when I talk to people about this, I think they are interested. I know there's kind of a back to basics movement, but I think it's more than back to basics. I think it's using the past to prepare us for the future, and that sort of transformation of Agile needs to happen. The other thing about that is, in 2001, the lightweight methods community was tiny.
Mm.
And so we could write a methodology or a manifesto that kind of talked about what that community thought was important. One of I think the most ironic things about the Agile Manifesto is that you had 17 techies who focused in on people and their interactions and collaboration as being a critical piece of this. And it is kind of ironic, techies talking about people as being the critical piece, but that was really what we thought. So I think that you may have an extension of the manifesto in some form, and maybe there's a Scrum version, maybe there's a less version, maybe there's some other versions, because the community is so big now, you're never going to write a manifesto, a new one, or revise the old one that's going to be acceptable to all of those different communities. So maybe those communities take the basics of what worked and what's valuable and then add their own stuff to it. So that's kind of where I see it going. I don't see us rewriting the manifesto.
I love that. I love that you say that. And I often hear people saying, well, the manifesto is broken because it doesn't do X and it doesn't do Y. Well, it was never meant to do that, right? As you said, speed of evolution and the change.
Right. I hear people saying, you left out X. Well, hell, we didn't know about X back then, you know?
Exactly right. That wasn't even around
years ago.
People think about it.
But I saw a little blurb on LinkedIn not too long ago, a couple months ago, that talked about problems with Agile or the myths about Agile. And I wrote them in and said, these are the same myths we talked about 23 years ago. Don't you have any new ones?
And this is the thing, right? So if we're still having those problems, then the manifesto in itself is still quite valid. As you said, we don't throw the baby with the bathwater. But I think that I like that idea of extension. Let me ask you the other question that always comes to my mind with that, and I'm interested because obviously being involved with the Heart of Agile movement, we talk about we've created a complexity in our own right? Because there is a million scaling different things that have risen. There's business agility. There's a dozen different methods. We've all been through the brand wars, hate that. But what's your thought on that? You know, it's paring it back to lesser, I think helps, but then you have to have that clicking that you're just talking about of the right things for the right place.
What appealed to me about the Heart of Agile, from what little I've looked at it, is that it speaks to mindset more so than methodology or methods. And just the simplicity of the four corners, I think, is really important. That people hone in, whether it's the four corners of Heart of Agile or whether it's the four values of the manifesto. I think it's really important that we get back to what inspired people about the manifesto. I think that's the thing that's maybe missing in a lot of places today, is that inspiration and that passion. One of the things that happened right when the manifesto came out that a lot of people don't remember is that Ward Cunningham did a really important thing. He set up a page where you could sign up and talk about what you liked or didn't like about the manifesto. Over the next 10 years or so, 15,000 people wrote blurbs in that thing. And finally, they had to shut it down because they were getting too much spam. But people were excited about Agile at that point in time. They were passionate about it. They glommed onto it because it was new and different, and it was how they wanted to work. And I want to figure out a way to get back that passion and inspiration of the original manifesto.
And I think you talk about that well in the book about, the methods, methodologies and mindsets and that mindset piece. The other thing that I picked up on, though, that I really like, and I wonder, you say the excitement's been taken out. And I personally think that you're right on the money there. That's probably part of the problem, is this prescriptive agility or prescriptive agile versus adaptive agile, right? If you haven't got 7.5 or book 7.9, then you're not agile and you've got to follow this. What's your thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, it's interesting. I actually was thinking about that some today. I think prescriptive agility is fine while you're training, while you're basically learning what it's all about. So if you want to go to a Scrum class or you want to go to an XP class and they talk to you about the basics and say, okay, you do these 6 things, I think that's fine. But once you get past that, once you get a little bit of experience, that the core of agility is adaptability. And the core of adaptability is experimenting, getting the data, learning, doing feedback, adapting. And that works. That's for the methodology as well as the software. So you've got to constantly adapt the methodology that you're using. The question in my mind that I was wrestling with today is, why are people still doing it? There's a reason that they're still doing prescriptive agility, and I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, it's a belief that they can get to some sort of highly consistent approach, no matter who they use in terms of talent, and that's just doesn't work. So I think there's still a lot of the historical process-oriented command control, consistency, repeatability mindset that's out there that we've got to deal with. And one of the ways to do that is to really identify more crisply why these people are still in that mode. What is it that they're trying to do? I was responded to somebody's LinkedIn post the other day about repeatability, and we got repeatability from the manufacturing quality control era. And repeatability is if you want to produce the same machine part time after time after time after time, but the process itself is mechanical and the inputs are very well controlled. And so what you want for a software development process is you don't want repeatability. What you want is reliability. You want to reliably be able to attack a number of different problems, no matter who you have on the team, no matter what some of the external variables are, and still come up with a result. But I think it's still that old mindset that's creeping in.
So is it a fear factor, Jim? When I talk to people, organizations about it, the thing I often say to them is, when you invest in agility or agile, by its very rote, it sort of disseminates control. And if you have a very command and control environment or mindsets, and you take away control, they only have one lever to pull then. And that's when I see command start to take over and try and grab it all back. And I think I wonder to myself if that's why they latch onto these very prescriptive, frameworks. I'm not going to denigrate any framework, but, they latch onto the prescriptiveness because they can apply command to it. I was interested to hear your take on it because you've been watching it for a long time.
Yeah, I was hoping we were getting past some of that because that was really, really prevalent in the 90s. And one of the things that generated the Agile movement was this command control sort of management style. And I started writing about a new management style, even in my first book, talking about leadership collaboration management as a new kind of management paradigm. But I think things change slowly. And I've seen data that says, many companies are trying to be more agile, be more digital, and that 80% of them are failing. That's probably a fairly good number. And can we hope for better than that? I'm not sure, given the rate of change in our world, that maybe that's a high number to shoot for. But I think we can do better. But there's a lot of loss of momentum, I think, and it just takes a while. So I'm not sure how we get out of that, other than pushing. You talked about business agility or enterprise agility. I think one of the things the Agile community has to offer the business community is 20 years of trying to make this stuff work.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right, and you touched on it before, and I was going to make sure we came back to it. It was agile leadership. I think the other thing is it is a change. It is a distinct change in the pattern of leadership when you start addressing or embracing agility, whether it be just in the software environment or in the sum of the whole and the business agility. Talk to me a little bit about your thought about that, because you've written on that a fair bit, but I think from what you're saying and what we've just discussed, that's probably one of the big keys, right?
Well, it's interesting. At the end of the book that I've just written, I put some criteria down there for an adaptive agile manager. And I got to thinking about those characteristics. And so one of the things that I got to thinking about is there are a lot of us who are consultants, academics, pundits, who are trying to push what agile leadership is up to the C-level. Okay, here's what you ought to be doing. Here's what you ought to be doing. Here's what you ought to be doing. And I had the idea of maybe we ought to turn that around, and maybe we ought to listen to what senior executives have to say about agility. And I got that idea from a new book by Jenny Romedy, who is the CEO of IBM for 8 years. And she's just written a book that came out in the spring called Good Power. And as I read through this book, I said, here is a CEO who really understands what it means to be an agile leader. And I'm in the process of writing some stuff about that. And it sort of put me on a kick to look at some other CEOs. So I've gotten a number, about a half a dozen books that CEOs have written, and I'm trying to match the criteria that I put together for agile leaders to see are these leaders doing some of that. And what I got out of that is, at least for this subset of leaders, and I don't think it includes everybody, but for this subset of leaders, they're more agile than we give them credit for.
Mm.
And it's a real revelation to me.
So if that is the case, then what's the permutation that's stopping their organization from becoming and adopting that agility then? Is it just that the behemoth of the machine is a bit like the Titanic?
I think part of it is the machine. In other words, in the size. So for example, IBM at the behest of Romedy is huge, but she thought that they needed to change internally. They needed to change their culture. So she implemented a program of agile and design thinking as one way to change their culture. And they spent $5 billion on that over 10 years.
Yeah.
It takes an enormous investment to do it right. And and they're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. But and what she had to do to get the money to do that is part of, I think, the issue with long view leadership, which is what I think you need for agile. And the short-term Wall Street demands don't match up. And the short-term Wall Street demands keep some high-level leaders from making the kind of moves that they would like to make or that they think are necessary, just because it might hurt some interim earnings. And so I think that Wall Street actually, in the way they operate, is a drag on that process of instilling agility wider in an organization. So it speaks to the very basics of capitalism which is a bigger issue than most software developers want to get into. But I think it's an important issue.
And I think you might have just found another book there, Jim. So I know you've decided a working life, but there certainly might be another book in that. I'll just throw that out there for you. I'm sure everybody would like to hear some your stories and the threads on that. But hey, look, we're very close to the end of our time, and there's so many questions, so many other things I could ask you. But I'll make sure that we put that particular book in the show notes that Jim talked about, so that people can access that as well. Along with that, I just want to thank you for spending some time with us, but not just for that, for writing the actual book, because I think for anyone who's watching this, if you haven't read the book, I would say to you, please do read the book, because it gives you such a tapestry of where Agile came from and how software has evolved and how management techniques have evolved. So it's an actual tapestry of those things involved. It's very rare that you come across something like that. So I'd really like to thank you for that, writing that and being here with us today. The other thing is, how can people get in touch with Jim Highsmith? How can they talk to you perhaps about a new book?
Well, my website is jimhighsmith.com, and I hang out on LinkedIn quite a bit.
Yeah, Jim's very responsive. I can guarantee that on LinkedIn. So, look, Jim, it's been fantastic to have you on all the remote things. If you're watching this as usual, don't forget, you want to join our community, remoteaf.co, click the community button. It's been fantastic to have you today. Thank you so much for being on all the remote things, Jim.
Thank you, Tony. I enjoyed it.